I just have to let this out. In my life, where I have reviewed several process maps at different levels and different types, I see that there are common problems. So this content is for people who are going to try to make process maps. Think of this like a checkbox on what you need to do. Very important part of this are standards. And I'll explain that in a bit. When you're going to go through a process map, or anytime I see a process map that's transferring a knowledge from one person to another, they're trying to train someone, there's always that gap that's missed. And why does this happen? The very first thing that happens is because a process is an arbitrarily human set start and end point. For me, the buying process could be from A to B. The buying process for you could be from B to C or B to D. That gets complicated with the scope of roles and who you're communicating to. For example, if somebody is a team leader, his or her scope in the buying process is different from somebody on another level, right? If you're just showcasing top-down what is happening, you have to know who is involved and what is their involvement there. But to simplify things, we just communicate what is on the lower level. Now, sometimes you would have somebody that does not have the proficiency to communicate a complex topic to someone, or to simplify it, or explicitly excludes certain parts, gives hints on that, but does not give a top-down approach. Top-down approach works for me a lot, and this is why I get a lot of confusion from other people. We're going to give me the details of something without telling me the context. I get confused, so I discard that information, right? And I will go through experience to try to understand it. That's one of the issues, right? Process scope, start and end. Just like saying the country starts here and ends here. It's still loose by this day. That's why there are wars, right? Because a landmark is something that's arbitrarily set by humans. It's not something natural. It's something that is you refer to something as this to this. Okay? Scope, roles, also complicated. The start and end, the process map, the combinations of actions in one box. Anytime I see an and or an or, that's a red flag. You should avoid that, and it's better to break it down into pieces. And I've seen that when I try to process map, it feels like people or specialists say, oh, you're confusing this too much. But if you are going to transfer this to somebody, this information to somebody, they will get confused. Even if they are specialists in the similar field, they might confuse or miss something because you're communicating something in the same box. To simplify, it would be best to have just one noun and one verb and how it's done. Okay, so let's go to how. Systems are always one of the issues that cause, things to be confusing, because in part they have simplified process so much that they are not seen as part of the process. But how you represent a system as a means to do something, let's say create invoice using SAP, right? Is different from SAP is the one doing the invoice for you. So process mapping that is a lot different. Especially I've seen people that are specialists in the domain saying create a process a PO, right? But people don't typically do that. It's just automatically done, right? As an outcome of multiple steps beforehand. And nobody goes to the detail of explaining what are the steps in between. As for somebody who's an accounting person, might have an idea of what this is, but this is an assumed thought. You assume based on, you hired someone based on that, right? Another is cross functions, handoffs, and weights. They are a problem for process because a lot of people don't know or don't even consider if there are weights or handoffs, and they would just consider it as a buy process. They at sometimes get blamed that they are very slow with their process, but in fact it could have been a wait for another person, it lacks an approval somewhere or something like that. And these are not properly mapped because usually when you have a boss, they don't want to process map with you, right? So it is always still best to do Genbutsu process map where you do it as it's being done and ask along the way. The way you would ask always when you're process mapping would be always tedious. People would always think it's tedious, but you require the clarity. And this is what I've noticed with working with AI when I'm trying to do process maps, is because some people will think that AI can just get from context, and it can. And the reason is because people cannot prompt properly. So they cannot communicate clearly the context before providing something. In providing context and standards, this is very important, that we should agree on what an action, a task, an activity is. This is one of the core concepts why people get confused on what it is. When you're referring to a noun, it could be an object or it could be a noun or a proper thing. When you're when you have a process map, you want something to be done to something. Do verb to something, or something assumes the state of, like a verb, as a state of being for the verb. It could happen naturally or it could be triggered. The manual and automatic trigger confuses some people sometimes, but that is what is actually happening, right? So for example, a car gets soaked in paint. It's wasn't me who soaked it, but the soaked car is then. If you go to the third step, what you do after the soaking and the polishing, right, you would not add a step in between because it was already being done by the system or the process. Okay? People who will try to use process mapping software or Visio for the first time, they will think that the software is inefficient or it doesn't work really well. The problem is they are not very clear on their context, and what AI will just do is just leapfrog past their lack of knowledge of how to communicate properly, right? I think this will be the biggest skill that is critical for people, because you have to provide the context. And I see that happening a lot with long-form content, where people have to provide the context, and there are a lot of haters who will say, with disregarding the context of why something is created or what something is based on an agreed standard, let's say, of what a definition of gender is, right? Visual representation is an issue as well, because how things are communicated visually is also a problem. Although I see it as an advantage because I am akin to that, it is a problem for some people, because when you have a system, do you put that inside the process box, or is that the link towards another thing? That is another complication. There is a way to solve this, but this is something I'm trying to solve for programmatically, right? Another is data. Data information. Even the basic definition of data information is confusing to some people. But when you're transferring data, when you're communicating something, people cannot communicate very clearly. What does that mean? When you communicate something, you have an objective, you have a word, you have a thought, and an emotion. You communicate all of this in one go. The outcome is only assumed by the recipient of the information before coming up with the response onto what this is. So imagine this is a process. You're sending information A to information B. Sometimes it doesn't match. For example, a field is string while a field is Boolean or continuous. There is a mismatch. They will not communicate. And I saw this do a lot when I was working with master data management teams or customer master teams. And people miss this, and this investigation was actually a premium because people could not understand that complexity. None of them were formally trained, but of course there were people that could naturally incline to that based on their proclivity of understanding things, right? I'm doing a 3D process mapping tool that will map automatically the process, and I'm hoping to standardize that for all standard process like procurement, import, export, stuff like that. Accounts payable, accounts receivable. And this is where it will get confusing for some people, but I'm trying to do it programmatically. Right? I might release that sometime soon after I do it. Okay? I think there's going to be a need for domain specialists that they can understand, pinpoint. Well, actually, I wouldn't say pinpoint. They most of the time can say at the particular area in the process. But I rarely see people who can speak both languages based on domain specialization. For example, if it is, that's a credit risk evaluation, it missed because on the past automatic sweep, on the manual sweep, this field was neglected, right? Or it could be this field was not visible. Those things, I think there's going to be a need for that, especially, I don't think those types of people will lose their jobs. They could be, the highest rated people because of their ability to see through how things are going in the overall sense of things, and then how they impact between the communication and what's being missed. How they approximately say that, I find that a problem, because most of people cannot pinpoint to a certain problem. Like, the domain specialist will tell me, field A, B, C is so-and-so, right? And the gap is because field A is A to B, where A is string and B is continuous, right? Just an example. Um, right. Standard problems that you might see that you want to include in your checklist are unending loops. A decision box where what happens when it's not decided on, or they're too shy to say because the approval has to be followed up. Then that question should be asked: who should be following up, and at what point is that followed up? And this is a common problem with levels of approval. You would have different approval levels. Let's say somebody at 5 million would be approving at this level, somebody at 1 million would be approving at this level. Does it have to grow through multiple approvals, or does it have to be approved by the person at the top only? I've seen this happen, but I think that's also wasteful, these approvals, right? Just because of the amount cut off. There'd also be scope cut off that is an issue within a process, and that is also a challenge when you're trying to represent a process map. You could say that the approval process is a higher level, but the approval process would be involving different people based on the amount. So you'd have a gradient of like amounts from 50 to 5 million, right? And the approvers would be different. And that would be complicated by the roles and the handovers and whatnot, right? Yeah. Another thing is like the ideal level. Going back to the buying situation, buying could be purchase requisition, PO approval, sourcing, vendor management, vendor management, then contracting, the credit risk review, for the if they're gonna get you as a customer, shipping, label, tax, docketing. But it could be just buying for a simple process like I go to a store, give $1, get a lollipop, right? The problem is sometimes people try to make a process map with the verbs of the nouns of the high level with the low level item. And this causes confusion as well for people because, buy process. Okay, what do I do with that? And some leaders would think that they are instructing clearly, but they are not. Because they do not, and even if you ask them, they feel like they're being cumbersome by somebody who's asking them, right? And neither would the person that's being instructed know exactly what to do just because of lack of information. If he or she had experience, you don't know if he or she had the experience of the entire detail of what needs to happen in the buying process. If you just say, if you talk to a CEO and say, we need to buy this, in his or her mind, the process starts with, okay, I need to go to sourcing. I don't need to go to sourcing because I'm an existing vendor, or I have an existing vendor, but I'm happy with him. But if you ask somebody from purchasing, they say, log it in Ariba, right? These are things that, gosh, I just really need people to know when I'm doing process maps with them. Is there are so many gaps that they're trying to address, but it's leading to more confusion. In a basic sense, what you need to do as human is just to provide the context for which all of the people will have a standard understanding. And if you don't, which I've tried this as well in some bigger organizations, is that I tried to set the standard, but they were not adjusting to it. And they were like thinking, okay, I have my own better price. So and even if you try to give a simpler one that would adapt to everybody, people did not. And I tried this with the buying process, with the sales process, where you do a service handoff to the Philippines. Like, it's pretty common in the Philippines where you do a BPO. So I was trying to map out how that happens and how the acquisition and transfer of talent would happen, the reviewers and the onboarding and all of that, right? When the buy is, when the cutover, handover is, and at which level that happens. And what I saw as well is that different roles will have different impact, and they do not really know where they're impacted. So screening a list of process steps for who is involved and to whom is involved is another thing, but I think I've alluded to that indirectly from some of the concepts I mentioned earlier. So I hope that was helpful. If you are process mapping, please try to make a checklist of the things that you're going to set a standard for. And if you want one-on-one coaching, I'd be happy to talk to you about process mapping, right? This is it's something I've been doing since I was like K2. And how I process things has always been visual, always been strategic on why I think something is important, and has never failed me, right? Yeah, thank you for listening. I just really needed to get that out. I'm so passionate about this.